This is the story of Air Niugini Flight 73. On the 28th of September 2018, a 737 was on its way from Pohnpei to Chuuk in Micronesia. The flight was normal, but unknown to the passengers, the plane was slowly going off course and they were headed straight for disaster. In today's video, we're going to explain how a plane that was supposed to land on runway 4 of Chuuk Airport ended up hitting the water short of the runway and eventually sinking just meters from the runway. As the plane approached the tiny island in the Pacific, the pilots were busy talking about the approach that they were about to attempt. They were talking about the flaps that they'd be using for the landing. The co-pilot figures out that if they use 40 degrees of flaps, then they'd need 150 fewer meters of runway to stop, and so the crew decided to use 40 degrees of flaps on the approach. The crew went over other aspects of the landing, including what to do if they didn't have the runway in sight or if they had to do a go-around. At 10:54 p.m. UTC, they were right about to start their descent, and the captain realized that they were already too high. The captain realized that they had to start their descent immediately. So they started their descent from 40,000 feet at a rate of almost 1,000 feet per minute. They leveled off at 34,000 feet. As they talked to the ATC, the captain realized that they were still way above the descent profile. And now, they still needed to get the plane down. At 11:08 p.m., the plane contacted Chuuk Approach for a weather update. The pilots are still above the descent profile. Shortly afterwards, at 11:11 p.m. UTC, the plane was at 18,000 feet. At 11:15 p.m., the plane was at 15 nautical miles from Chuuk Airport and at an altitude of 8,600 feet. They continued the descent. When they hit 4,000 feet, the captain says, "All right, the missed approach is," but he did not continue, and the co-pilot did not respond. At 11:21 p.m., the captain says, "We just configure as we can." As he extended the flaps to 15. The captain calls for the landing checklist, and the co-pilot responds with landing gear, flaps, lights, and runway in sight, an obviously incomplete landing checklist. When they hit 1,000 feet, the co-pilot says, "Okay, stable." They continued with the approach. As the co-pilot said the go-around altitude on the mode control, the plane was still above the 3-degree approach profile, and the captain disconnects the autopilot and says, "All right, I'm going back on profile." When they hit 548 feet, the plane entered a storm cell and the visibility was heavily reduced. Shortly afterward, the co-pilot says, "Visual 1 red, 3 whites," most likely referring to the PAPI lights at the end of the runway. The EGPWS callout occurs shortly afterwards. They were now at the minimum safe altitude. If they were going to go for a go-around, this was the time. Another callout can be heard. "Sink rate, sink rate." The captain says, "I just want to get on profile," meaning that he was still above the glide slope and was descending at an unsafe rate to intercept the glide slope. The computerized voice says, glide slope," which means that the plane is well below the safe glide slope for this approach. Another sink rate warning sounds, and the pilot can be heard saying, "That's fine, I'll just go a little bit more." The plane keeps descending. The EGPWS system calls out sink rate again. The co-pilot can be heard saying, "Too low, we're too low, we're too low, we're too low." The plane shortly afterwards crashes into a lagoon off of Chuuk Airport. The plane's fuselage cracks and it stays afloat for a few moments, allowing everyone to escape the plane. However, one passenger died in the ordeal. Looking back on the flight, the investigators find a slew of things wrong with the flight. Before they started their descent, remember how they decided on flaps 40 for landing? The co-pilot had used a company-issued iPad to calculate the approach speed. Air Niugini had provided the iPad for training purposes, and the iPad was not certified for operational use. Using the iPad to plan a landing was a breach of operational rules. In addition to this, the communication between the crew during the approach was subpar. For example, the landing checks were barely carried out, and many items were skipped. The co-pilot was supposed to be monitoring the flight and should have called for a go-around on multiple occasions. He did not express any form of discontent until the very last moments. The lack of situational awareness in the cockpit was to be seen. This crew had 3 alarms blaring at them, one of them asking them to pull up, and here we have a crew that's insistent on landing this plane. The crew was too focused on getting the plane on the ground. In a stroke of luck for the investigators, the approach was filmed from inside the plane, and it shows the pilots in the cockpit and all their instruments. The approach was unstabilized, and when they entered the rain shower, all visuals with the runway was lost. In the video, you could see the words "pull up" written in bold red letters appear on the screen, and at the end of the approach, the pilots fully disregarded that warning. The crew should have initiated a go-around long before they got to this point, but they still did nothing. The crew was fixated on one task, and that was getting the plane on the ground. It turns out that the crew losing situational awareness and them being fixated on the landing was a bad combination. They had no idea what altitude that they were at, and the fixation caused them to disregard warnings that would have otherwise saved them. Adding fuel to the fire, the investigators found that crews had received similar oral alerts on previous approaches in visual conditions where the aircraft safely landed. This would have contributed to the perception that the alerts during the accident approach were nuisance alerts and therefore disregarded them. The investigators decided that the lack of an oral pull-up warning was the final nail in the coffin for Flight 73. With them fixated on the landing, it seems reasonable that they never even saw the pull-up warning. A hard oral warning might have made them take evasive action. In the end, a hasty descent led to a crew losing their situational awareness, coupled with low visibility, target fixation, which caused them to not arrest the descent that they put themselves into to intercept a glide slope. This caused them to descend below the glide slope and to eventually crash into the ocean. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. A big thank you to MYLOSAIRPLANEFAN for letting me use his amazing videos on my video. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow.